Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Now, we often say that the media is the fourth estate of the realm and also the watchdog of our society, especially in a democracy like ours. But when it seems that the watchdog is being attacked, seemingly attacked, what does this say first of that society, and what implication does this have?
Well, it has very grave implications for our democracy because, like you know, a free press is not a privilege, it's a necessity for any great society to thrive. And so the freedom of the press is not just an important thing to have, it's an imperative for a functioning democracy. And once you threaten that, you threaten the very core of a democratic society. You lose vigilance, you lose the ability to hold those in authority to account, which leads to abuse, to excesses, to impunity, and of course, to poor governance that inadvertently impoverishes the people, and leaves them in penury. So it's cardinal to always have a fair and impartial and a free press.
And when you look at the fact that we are in a time where everyone has access to the social media, to the internet, how do we strike a balance between ensuring press freedom and also the police also doing their duties? Because some experts will say that their own defense might be that whatever was published was sort of causing a breakdown of law and order and sort of tarnishing the image of an individual. So what do you make of this statement?
There's a difference between people who use social media and people who are journalists. I think it's important to make that important clarification. That journalists use social media as a tool to disseminate information or to report their story does not truly mean that there are some social media urchins who are seeking unnecessary attention or who are, like many people who lay all these petitions would like to claim, stalking people, on social media. That is truly not the case. For many journalists who use social media, it is simply an avenue to disseminate information, to share that story, and to draw attention to the important work that they are doing. But like you have rightfully said, it appears that the Cybercrime Act has become to journalists today what Decree 2 was to many journalists in the 1990s, the early 1990s and the late 1980s. A draconian law that was used to terrorize journalists, to abuse the rights of well-meaning Nigerians, to detain arbitrarily journalists for stories that offended the sensibilities of those in power and in authority. And that cannot be acceptable, especially, like I said, if you want to hold those in authority to account. Now, this does not mean that I support the abuse of such privileges that journalists do have to be watchdogs of the society. I do not excuse that certain people, have used some of these powers, or abused some of these powers that they have to hold governments to account. But at least at the bare minimum, what we would like to see is a situation where even though those in authorities are aggrieved by certain things that are published, the journalists or the platforms in which they work for should be giving fair hearing or the decency to at least arrest these individuals with their dignities intact, not what we have seen in recent times where people are essentially abducted and you cannot tell their whereabouts until there is public outcry before the arresting authorities finally decide to admit that XYZ journalist is in their custody. We can't afford a descent into a society where rules no longer matter, where the rights of individuals are abused arbitrarily. There has to be a level of decorum, especially, looking back where we are coming from and the fact that we have to make progress, collectively as a society. So it's important because even these people who make many of these arrests, when they run into trouble, when they are sacked or when they are wrongly treated, they always run to the journalists to carry their stories. So why would you treat, journalists with such impunity and such disregard, for a story that seems to offend the sensibilities of those in authority? I always say that, journalists are in the business of printing what those in power do not like, because the moment those in authority enjoy what journalists write every day, then you cease to be journalists. You have become public relations officers and not journalists. It's not the job of the journalists to sing praises of those in authority. That's why they have spokespersons. That's why they have public relations organizations on retainer. The job of the journalist is to hold those in power to account. And that is exactly what the citizens of this country would like to see, especially at a time where they're dealing with they're dealing with very serious economic challenges, and they're grappling with, the daily hustle, and trying to survive this harsh economic climate.
Right. Now, because of the matter of accountability that you brought forward, there are those who will say matters of accountability or holding persons to account might be relative as it is, depending on who is reading and how they interpret it. How can we navigate this path in such a way that journalists are fair and balanced in their approach towards this matter of accountability in our democracy?
Well, I think every trained journalist understands the basic principle when you're reporting, especially investigative stories, the fact that you have to give the person, in some instances, a right of hearing, which means you get their own side of the story. And if you have done your own part to seek the side of the story, of the people or the person that you're writing about, and they prove to be evasive, and you do all you can, nobody stops you from going ahead to write the story, publish and be damned, right? And like I said, if people feel aggrieved, they have the right to seek redress in court and let the courts make the final pronouncements. What we're against is a situation where you abduct journalists, where journalists are tortured, where journalists have to go through untold hardship because of stories that they report. It's unconscionable and it's unacceptable. And I'd like to find a situation where other media organizations, civil society organizations, and the Nigerian citizens rally around these journalists who go through this very, very uncomfortable and sometimes overbearing overbearing processes by security agencies. It's unacceptable, except, of course, we admit that we no longer want to run, a democracy, and we want to decide to be under some. Even in the height of military dictatorship, the journalists stood up to be counted. Listen, if you permit me, and I think it's important to remind journalists and the Nigerian people what certain journalists had to go through. And because, again, this particular administration, was in the forefront of the Nadeco movement, and many people in this administration were icons of the press at the time where they stood up to military dictatorship. You would recall where the likes of Bayo and Onuga walked out of the African Concord because they did a story that offended the sensibilities of General Ibrahim Babangida, and they refused to retract. They decided to resign and go out and start their own newspaper because they believed in a free press and a press that held those in authority to account. You will recall that the same Bayo Ononuga and his colleagues, the likes of Sheike Ede Dapo, Oloriyomi, and of course, Babafemi Ojodu, when they reported the story of the phantom coup that essentially saved the lives of so many young officers, the likes, of President Obasanjo and the likes who were implicated in that particular phantom coup in 1995. And all of these journalists, the likes of George Umba, the likes of Kulajibadi, were sentenced to life in prison for daring to report the truth, that soldiers were tortured to death. The likes of Major Oni was killed in detention because of a phantom coup story, right? And so these journalists stood up to be counted during military dictatorship in their early 20s and in their early 30s. They did not care for their lives. They stood up for what they believed in. And so they are in power now. Many of them are in power today. And I'm surprised that they will tolerate this level of abuse against journalists in our country. And it's important that we hold these engagements and remind them of the struggle that they led during their, and to know that the press is not necessarily antagonist to those in power, but really and truly it's in the business of holding people to account. And it's nothing malicious. It's just that those in power need to be accountable to the Nigerian people.
And talking about being accountable,